Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples as the First Nation owners on the lands on which we meet. I'm obviously not talking about the pandemic today, but don't be alarmed, I'll still be talking about something that's rather urgent. So to begin, obviously climate change mitigation is also going to take a massive global effort. So just as the pandemic has changed all of our lives dramatically, so too we must commit to find global ways to address these rising temperatures and do whatever we can to mitigate it. So there is going to be so much required for this to happen, to keep our greenhouse gas emissions at the lower level. And we also, while doing this, we cannot ignore the different levels of economic development that exist throughout the world. So one debate that exists is that global technology should be disseminated to all countries openly. And this means, obviously, waiving intellectual property rights. However, instead of leaving this to the decisions of private corporations, some would suggest that this needs to be a decision at a multilateral level, and we should have an agreement at the WTO to waive IP protection through the TRIPS agreement. So in my presentation, I've considered arguments, beginning with the claim that the TRIPS agreement strikes the right balance of protection between private interests and flexibility for WTO members when those agreement obligations are implemented properly. However, this does not mean that all is well in terms of climate change technologies. I draw on research that shows that technology transfer is actually just the beginning. And really, there needs to be a more meaningful commitment from all countries if we are going to reduce the risk of climate change. So I could have started well before Paris, but I thought I'd cut to some of the more recent negotiations. To simplify things somewhat, please forgive me, the Paris Agreement in 2015 basically allowed countries to set their own targets, to decide for themselves what they could commit to in their nationally determined contributions. So the idea was to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees. So there was this fear, and it was a well-founded fear, that not enough had been done, and the commitments that followed the Paris Agreement would be nowhere near enough to achieve this target. So most recently in Glasgow, COP26, parties came together with a goal to set the best possible targets they could to keep this 1.5 degree warming alive. This was the goal, to keep it to 1.5. Above that, I don't think I need to talk about the potential catastrophic events. The argument was that it was still achievable. And Glasgow, the negotiators came out claiming it was a success, and perhaps this was because they managed to come to an agreement that from the outside it seems that not enough was done. Certainly not enough was pledged by the parties to keep us to this 1.5 degree warming, and they've all agreed to come back in 2022, go back, do a little bit more work, see where you can cut some more emissions and see what else you can do. There were some other commitments at Glasgow, however, that are particularly relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. So first off, they agreed to phase down. It was to be phased out, but this was changed to phase down at the last minute, the use of unabated coal. And this is the use of coal where CO2 escapes into the atmosphere. They also agreed to eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I knew I was going to mess that up. Okay, so I first wanted to start with the subsidies, eliminating the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I could probably talk about this for the entire 20 minutes, but I won't do that to you. So as an aside, arguably, all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient. It's bringing down the cost of production. It's not recognising the externalities that are placed on the environment, such as greenhouse gas emissions being released. And it also, of course, will impede, if we bring down this cost so much, it can potentially impede technological development to move towards clean energy development. I've noted on the slide, however, that there's 2 different types of subsidies, and I haven't sort of taken a deep dive into this, but if I was going to just touch on it briefly, I would suggest that production subsidies will be the ones that are considered to be most inefficient, bringing down the cost of production, potentially impeding its technological development, because the consumption subsidies, when consumers, particularly disadvantaged groups, their power is subsidised as one of these essential elements of life, then that's potentially one that should not be eliminated before we move to more renewable energies, of course. So moving on to coal power. So this is interesting. At Glasgow, at COP26, the parties agreed to phase down the use of unabated coal generation, and that's described, I've already mentioned, the use of coal that is not mitigated with technologies to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, such as carbon capture, utilisation and storage. So coal power generation is the single biggest cause of global temperature increases, and therefore there is an urgent need to scale up the deployment of clean power to accelerate the energy transition. This leaves open the idea of carbon capture and storage as a way to reduce emissions, however. And I'm not going to turn this into a critique of carbon capture and storage, but it is, to say the least, controversial. So carbon capture technologies, they basically involve capturing the CO2 at power stations, transporting it to storage locations, which is usually deep underground, and isolating it there. So these technologies are still at the demonstration and early commercialisation stage. At the moment, there are 37 million tonnes of a year of emissions being abated through CCS. This is on the increase. But to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, on top of what was pledged at COP26 at Glasgow, there needs to be somewhere between 23 and 27 billion tonnes of additional emissions pledged. That's just the pledge. That's not the actual reduction. It's just countries putting their hand up saying, we can do this. And then them actually doing it, of course. So at the moment, CCS remains very controversial in terms of the safety and the benefits of it. And as it exists, even where it is next to a power station, only 90% of the emissions are actually captured. So it's not entirely clean. And before I talk about India, I just want to say I couldn't stand here as a citizen of Australia and say, we're one of the worst countries when it comes to our commitments to climate change. I've been studying climate change and Australian politics for the last 12 years, and so I've been through a few ups and downs, particularly as my PhD was right around the time that it was being used as political football. So believe me, Australia is definitely what I consider to be a bit of a climate vandal, and we were certainly not without blame at COP26. But I just wanted to use the example of India here. So India is a country with a developing and mixed economy. They also require a huge amount of energy for their industrial processes as well as all of their social needs. So the majority of its energy demands are going to be fulfilled by coal-based power plants. So just India's power sector alone, they account for half of all of that nation's CO2 emissions. So CCS adoption in India is very, very poor. And so this provides the example that we need more technology transfer, of course. And it's also worth noting, so that unabated coal basically means coal can still be used as long as there's some sort of abatement, such as CCS. But the Indian delegation was the one that basically changed the wording right at the last minute at Glasgow, which I know Australia was supportive of as well. Okay, so climate technology. So this deficit of 23 billion tonnes of emissions, it's a number so astronomical it's hard to wrap your head around. So the importance of climate technology in achieving these reductions, it can't be understated. It's incredibly important. The International Energy Agency have said that almost half of the cumulative emissions reductions to get to net zero emissions by 2050, they need to come from technology that's not yet commercially available. I'm going to quote our Prime Minister. Scott Morrison recently said that the climate aims should be achieved through the best technology and the animal spirits of capitalism, not taxes like a carbon price. He also said the key to meeting our climate change ambitions is in the commercialisation of low emissions technology. Now, I would suggest that this is something of a cop-out. It's almost like having your magical birthday wish and blowing on the candles and hoping that somebody else fixes the problem for you, because obviously the changes that we need to see in our society are not just going to be from technology. It's far bigger than that. However, it is very incredibly important, and innovation, research and development obviously has to be encouraged in order for us to get to where we need to be. So that means our intellectual property rules need to strike a balance. So intellectual property, I understand I'm speaking amongst experts here, but it's here to ensure that the social costs of technology development are shared and that necessary goals can be realised. There's also an argument that high technology exports from advanced industrial economies to developing economies are actually improved where there's stronger patent protection in those countries. However, some commentators argue that ideal IP protection, it depends on what the actual purpose is of the protection itself, and that we need to consider this before we consider whether these laws need to be changed and the exclusions that need to come with these laws. So, for instance, if intellectual property is a means to reward innovation, then there's an argument that we need to retain these rules. Alternatively, if it increases the transactions costs to technology development and transfer, then we need to eliminate them and provide exemptions from any form of enforcement. So obviously at the international level, we have an agreement that the encouragement of innovation is important, and there are minimum requirements around this agreement. So the TRIPS agreement, we've heard about this already, it imposes these positive minimum requirements on member states in terms of their IP protection. In the TRIPS agreement, Article 1.1, it states that members are free to determine how to introduce the measures. So I think Mohammed was talking about the rules being different all over the world, and they are free but not obliged to impose stricter measures than those contained within the agreement. So some commentators argue that the TRIPS agreement is designed to ensure there are safeguards against strict IPR rules, so it's stopping there from being stricter IPR rules, and for the harmonisation of intellectual property rules amongst members, which leads to more efficiency when those rules are harmonised. So the TRIPS agreement also has a very important general objective, that intellectual property protection should contribute to technical innovation and to the transfer of technology. So the argument is where this is done properly, both the producers and users should benefit and the economic and social welfare should be enhanced, where it's done properly, where it's done the right way. So the intention is to ensure that new technologies are developed, but also that they are shared. So we've already heard about the 20-year protection, so under the TRIPS agreement, so there's a number of rules, but most relevant for climate change technologies, again, going to be the patent protection, which is 20-year protection for inventions, and that includes both the products and the processes, so the knowledge. So governments in some instances can actually refuse to issue a patent for reasons of public order or morality, but there is no exemption for environmental reasons under the TRIPS agreement. There's a lot of exemptions under different WTO agreements for environmental purposes, but the TRIPS agreement doesn't have one of them, unless this comes under what we call a national emergency, which I'm pretty sure we would argue that climate change is. The problem is it's an ongoing national and global emergency, as is the pandemic, but hopefully we're not going to be facing the pandemic for however long, but climate change is going to be ongoing. There's not going to be an end to it. And this could be a problem in terms of the exemptions that are afforded by TRIPS. So I don't think TRIPS was, the exemptions were developed with climate change in mind at all. So one article that could be considered something of an exemption or an objective of the TRIPS agreement is in Article 7, that states that the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights, it should contribute to the promotion of technological innovation and the transfer and dissemination of technology. So the obligation for developed countries to provide incentives for technology transfer is further provided in Article 66.2, and I'm just going to quote from it briefly. So developed country members shall submit annually reports on actions taken or planned in pursuance of their commitments under Article 66.2, and that's about the transfer of technology. They have to report on what they've actually done. To this end, they shall provide new detailed reports every third year, and in the intervening years provide updates to their most recent reports. So obviously these are the members, so the nations themselves that are providing these reports, but they just show how these private corporations have potentially been encouraged in terms of the technology transfer. However, a lot of members, in particular the least developed countries, feel that this requirement should be made more effective, but not enough is currently being done. So importantly, developing countries, they see technology transfer as part of the bargain, as part of the deal of them agreeing to protect intellectual property rights, because the overwhelming majority of the patents are held by developed country parties. Although there has been, in fairness, a rise in Chinese patents in recent times, so there's a little bit more of a balance between developed and emerging economies, but it doesn't solve the issue for the least developed countries. So arguably, the TRIPS agreement aims to achieve the transfer and dissemination of technology as part of its objectives, specifically requires developed country members to provide incentives for their companies to promote the transfer of technology to least developed countries through those reporting requirements. But importantly, they should be doing this. This is all part of climate justice. Let's keep in mind that the people who are going to suffer the most have contributed the least to climate change, and therefore this dissemination of technology support, also climate finance, of course, it's all part of climate justice that not enough is currently being done to achieve. So developed countries, leaving aside the most recent arguments about the TRIPS payment, developed countries usually have a lot of arguments against the reduction of intellectual property rules. So back in 2013, Ecuador raised the idea of environmentally sound technology not being subject or being subject to different rules under the TRIPS safeguard measures. But in response to this, so obviously this is back in 2013, so a little while ago, but the United States gave the example of a solar company who had supplied solar panels in India. They then had sufficient funds to expand their operations, and they suggested that the IP rules allowed for the nourishment and the protection for fledgling ideas. They suggested that innovation is fragile and critical work, and that often the research and development is the hardest part. And I'm sure that we can certainly agree with that. It's expensive, it's hard, and sometimes you don't get anything for it. They also suggested, the United States argument was, well, of course we have those flexibilities under the agreement, and we've already touched on this issue of compulsory licensing. So this means that there are arguments that a complete waiver is not necessary because we have things like compulsory licensing, where a license can be issued in emergency. So they can provide this emergency license where not one is otherwise granted. So these allow for these national emergencies or other circumstances of extreme urgency, like a pandemic, but there's restrictions on this, and there's a need to provide adequate compensation anyway, and where it has been done, it hasn't always been without controversy, of course. But Ecuador at the March 2013 TRIPS Council meeting called for a review of this article to determine if access to environmentally and sound technologies is being inappropriately restricted. So there have been other measures designed to facilitate technology transfer, but none of them seem to be taken up too broadly, such as the use of the climate finance through the Green Climate Fund to pay for these licenses. And this seems to have also seen some resistance from developed countries, and also the climate finance has a lot of requirements imposed on them. So licenses arguably is not a good use of those funds. So given that we have these other protections, although somewhat inadequate, there are these arguments that a waiver, a climate waiver is actually unnecessary, that the argument's slightly weakened. But if there was a waiver under the existing WTO rules, we'd need to consider what it actually does allow for as to whether it would achieve anything in terms of climate technology. So a waiver is allowed, of course, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here talking about it. But a waiver means that there wouldn't need to be any minimum IP protection. They could waive IP protection. However, most waivers are short-term in nature. We've already talked about the proposal for a 3-year waiver for the COVID vaccine. And any waiver that's granted for more than a year actually needs to be reviewed annually. So we need to be talking about a climate waiver every single year. So it's not going to be adequate as it's provided for under the rules as it is. 1 year would do absolutely nothing to resolve the global climate change emergency. And obviously, we've got this goal to get to net zero by 2050. Well, a lot of countries have a goal to get to net zero by 2050, of which Australia has agreed to. That's 28 years away. The WTO itself, it's only been around for 26 years. So it's quite a way off, and that's a lot of negotiation. And as we've seen, negotiations in the WTO can be interesting, slow, I'm sure painful for the people that are there. And this isn't the only problem when it comes to technology transfer. So a key barrier to technology diffusion is arguably not the lack of technology inflow. Rather, it's sometimes a problem with the developing country's ability to absorb and assimilate transferred technology. And this is not placing blame on developing countries. This is also the responsibility of all of us. So according to a UN study, the inflow of technology to Africa through foreign direct investment soared by over 800% between 2000 and 2008. So it's not just transfer, it's about the absorption. And for absorption, there needs to be 4 main things. Amongst other things, of course, these are just high-level things. So the development of new knowledge is absolutely crucial within those countries themselves, through new skills and experience within the country where the technology is to be deployed. We need to address within those countries, we don't, but collectively, cultural and social concerns about new technology. And as an aside, human rights issues with climate technologies are really, really significant. Just the transfer of technology is not enough. Local communities need consultation, and they often resist large climate change technologies, where the immediate and the long-term benefits from the use and installation, they're not well understood. And in fact, they can have a negative impact on local communities. So in many countries, also achieving long-term transformation can require new or updated legal frameworks. As a surprise, we're usually behind things, and that's often the case when it comes to these new technologies. And also, linked to the development of new knowledge and skills is the commitment to support technology over long periods. So without long-term maintenance, or a plan for long-term maintenance, imported technologies could only make a short-term impact, which clearly is not enough. They could become non-functional after a while due to a lack of maintenance or failure to regularly update the technology. It's an ongoing issue. So looking past the TRIPS agreement, and I'm not suggesting that we ignore the potential waiver, but there's just so many more things that will need to happen for this to become somewhat of a solution, for technology to become a solution. Looking past the agreement, we can need to consider other ways to develop human capital that's needed for these technologies, to develop new knowledge. So, for instance, staying with the WTO theme, we could think about the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which supports the liberalisation of services trade between parties. This means that people can provide services between countries and potentially develop skills and knowledge that may be needed. So a lot of developed countries have liberalised most of their modes of trade and services, but some barriers still remain, particularly with the flow of people. And of course, there would need to be a flow of people in both directions between developed to developing countries for this to occur. At the risk of stating the obvious, the COVID-19 pandemic has effectively reduced the flow of services, or effectively reduced the flow of people, and so this has posed somewhat of a barrier. So just to conclude, there are a number of conflicting arguments on this, and I'm not saying that we leave this idea of the TRIPS waiver aside, but in some ways it's a debate that needs to be put in the context of the emergency that we're facing and what needs to be done in order for these technologies to really achieve these reductions. There needs to be a balance in terms of the trade, the technology, research and development, and the development of human capital that's needed. So on the one hand, there's a suggestion that intellectual property standards across borders will facilitate trade, and it will facilitate legitimate trade, meaning that these technologies will go through those consultation processes, will look at human rights as being a priority. And certainly to achieve net zero by 2050, we need new technologies that don't exist at the moment. They need to be enhanced, those that exist currently. We need to know that there's safety in our carbon capture and storage rather than it being used as a get out of jail free card. So it's essential that this is done. However, if we enforce intellectual property, it could potentially become barriers to new technology transfer, So transfer to technology between countries and to developing countries in particular. So the commitment to reduce climate change and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, it must be increased dramatically. So that commitment, just agreeing to cut emissions, it needs to be increased severely by all nations, 23 billion tonnes a year, and that's on top of the commitments that were made at the COP26. So technology is going to be necessary, however, invention is potentially just the beginning. Thank you.